Imagine a world where the closest allies suddenly turn their backs on each other at the moment of greatest need, leaving one superpower humiliated on the global stage and forcing the other to question the very foundation of their unbreakable bond. This is not fiction. It happened in 1956, during the Suez Crisis, when the United States openly opposed Britain and France in their military intervention in Egypt, marking one of the most dramatic ruptures in the so-called special relationship. On July 26, 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company, previously controlled by British and French interests, threatening Western access to vital oil supplies from the Middle East. Britain, under Prime Minister Anthony Eden, viewed this as a direct challenge to its imperial influence and economic security. Together with France and Israel, they secretly planned a coordinated operation. On October 29, 1956, Israeli forces invaded the Sinai Peninsula, advancing toward the canal. Britain and France then issued an ultimatum demanding both sides withdraw from the canal zone, knowing Egypt would refuse. When Egypt rejected the demand, British and French aircraft bombed Egyptian airfields on October 31st, followed by paratroop landings and amphibious assaults in early November. The goal was to seize control of the canal and depose Nasser. However, President Dwight D. Eisenhower's administration in the United States reacted with swift and forceful opposition. Eisenhower condemned the action as outdated colonialism that risked pushing Arab nations toward the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War, especially as the Soviet Union was simultaneously crushing the Hungarian Revolution. The U.S. refused to provide any military or diplomatic support and instead pursued aggressive diplomatic measures. On November 2, 1956, the United Nations General Assembly adopted Resolution 997, sponsored by the United States, calling for an immediate ceasefire and withdrawal of forces, which passed by a vote of 64-5. The U.S. pushed hard for compliance. Economic pressure proved decisive. Britain faced a severe run on the pound sterling, with reserves plummeting. The United States threatened to sell off its holdings of British bonds and blocked access to International Monetary Fund loans that Britain desperately needed to stabilize its currency. Oil supplies were also affected, as the U.S. declined to offset the loss from the disrupted canal and Middle East embargo. Facing financial collapse and international isolation, Britain agreed to a ceasefire on November 6, 1956. Anglo-French forces began withdrawing in December, completing their exit by December 22nd, while Israel withdrew from Sinai by March 1957 under continued U.S. pressure. The crisis humiliated Britain, exposing its inability to act independently without American backing. Prime Minister Eden resigned on January 9, 1957, amid domestic outrage. The event accelerated Britain's decolonization process and signaled the end of its status as a dominant global power. For the United States, it affirmed its leadership in the Western Alliance and commitment to opposing European imperialism in the Third World. Although the special relationship recovered over time with agreements like the 1958 Mutual Defense Agreement restoring nuclear cooperation, the Suez Crisis left a lasting scar, reminding both nations that even the closest partners can clash when core interests diverge. This tension set a precedent for future disagreements, where Britain sometimes found itself unable or unwilling to fully align with American priorities, even as the alliance endured through shared intelligence, NATO commitments, and mutual defense needs. The crisis highlighted how economic leverage and differing views on global order could strain what Churchill had famously called the special relationship, a bond forged in 2 world wars, but tested repeatedly in the decades that followed. Picture the frustration of a powerful president pleading with his closest ally for even a small show of solidarity, perhaps just a symbolic unit or a bagpipe band, while that ally quietly but firmly says no, leaving the request hanging in the air like an unanswered phone call. This was the reality between 1964 and 1968, when President Lyndon B. Johnson repeatedly pressed British Prime Minister Harold Wilson to commit troops to the escalating Vietnam War, only to face consistent refusal despite intense personal diplomacy and economic leverage. The Vietnam War had intensified dramatically after the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in August 1964, which authorized Johnson to use military force without a formal declaration of war. By early 1965, U.S. combat troops landed at Da Nang, and troop numbers grew from a few thousand advisors to over 184,000 by the end of the year, eventually peaking at more than 500,000. Johnson launched Operation Rolling Thunder, a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam, and sought international legitimacy through the More Flags program, encouraging allies to contribute forces to demonstrate broad Western support against communism. Britain, as America's most intimate partner through NATO, shared intelligence via the Five Eyes Alliance, and historical wartime cooperation was a prime target for this appeal. In December 1964, shortly after Wilson's election victory in October, Johnson hosted him in Washington and directly asked for British troops, emphasizing the need for Allied participation to bolster morale and counter Soviet and Chinese influence. Wilson declined, citing Britain's role as co-chair of the 1954 Geneva Conference on Indochina, which had partitioned Vietnam and obligated neutrality in any renewed fighting, as well as ongoing military commitments in the Indonesia-Malaysia confrontation, where British forces were engaged in defending Malaysia against Indonesian incursions until 1966. Public opinion in Britain ran strongly against involvement. Polls showed overwhelming disapproval, with one 1966 survey indicating 81% opposed sending troops. Domestic anti-war sentiment was growing, fueled by protests, student activism, and media coverage of U.S. operations, making troop deployment politically toxic for Wilson's Labour government, which held a slim parliamentary majority. Economically, Britain was struggling with balance of payments crises, devaluation pressures on the pound, and the costs of maintaining overseas commitments. Diverting resources to Vietnam was seen as unsustainable. Despite these refusals, Wilson provided strong rhetorical and diplomatic backing, publicly supporting U.S. objectives while privately urging restraint. In February 1965, he expressed concern over escalation, and in 1966 and 1967, he made multiple peace initiatives, traveling to Moscow and Hanoi to mediate. Though these efforts yielded little, Johnson grew increasingly irritated. Declassified records show he viewed Wilson's hedging as unhelpful meddling, once reportedly snapping during a phone call that he would not accept British advice on how to run Vietnam, just as Wilson would not want interference in Malaysia. The strain peaked in 1967 when Johnson linked U.S. financial support for the pound, critical amid Britain's economic woes, to greater British cooperation on Vietnam, though no direct quid pro quo for troops materialized. Wilson resisted troop commitments even after the confrontation ended in 1966, prioritizing domestic stability and avoiding entanglement in what many in Britain saw as an unwinnable colonial-style conflict. Britain did offer limited non-combat support, including intelligence sharing, training advice drawn from Malayan experiences, and secret arms transfers, but never deployed combat forces. This stance frustrated Johnson personally. He famously complained about Wilson's reluctance, but it did not rupture the underlying alliance. The special relationship endured through continued nuclear cooperation under the 1958 Mutual Defense Agreement, joint intelligence efforts, and mutual interests in containing Soviet expansion. Under Wilson's successor, Edward Heath, from 1970, the policy remained similar. Heath reaffirmed no intention to send troops, even as U.S. involvement wound down toward the 1973 Paris Peace Accords and the eventual fall of Saigon in 1975. The Vietnam refusal highlighted Britain's growing independence in foreign policy after Suez, demonstrating that while the alliance was special, it was not unconditional. Britain could say no when vital national interests, public opinion, and economic realities clashed with American demands. This episode added another layer of complexity to transatlantic ties, showing that even in moments of profound disagreement, shared values and strategic necessities preserve the partnership for future crises. Imagine the moment when the leader of the free world stands before the world and warns his closest ally that walking away from a historic partnership could leave them isolated at the back of the queue, only for that ally to proceed anyway, sparking years of diplomatic tension, trade uncertainty, and a fractured transatlantic consensus on everything from security to climate. This was the reality surrounding Brexit, the United Kingdom's decision to leave the European Union, which began with the referendum on June 23, 2016, and culminated in the UK's formal exit on January 31, 2020, followed by the end of the transition period on December 31, 2020. From the outset, the United States expressed deep concern over the move. In April 2016, just weeks before the vote, President Barack Obama visited London and delivered a stark message, stating that if Britain left the EU, it would be at the back of the line for any trade deal with the United States, as America would prioritize agreements with the larger 500 million person EU market. Obama argued that Brexit would weaken both the UK and the West, diminish Britain's global influence, and complicate NATO unity at a time when Russian aggression in Ukraine was escalating. The warning drew sharp backlash from Brexit campaigners who accused him of interference. Yet it reflected a bipartisan American view that a united Europe was essential to U.S. interests. When Donald Trump took office in January 2017, the tone shifted dramatically. Trump became the first major world leader to enthusiastically endorse Brexit, calling it a great thing and predicting it would be followed by other exits from the EU. During his 2017 visit to the UK and subsequent meetings, Trump praised Prime Minister Theresa May's efforts and pushed for a swift, ambitious US-UK free trade agreement post-Brexit, promising it would be one of the largest and most lucrative deals ever. By 2019 and into the Biden administration starting January 2021, the promised quick deal evaporated. President Joe Biden, who had Irish heritage and long-standing ties to EU leaders, openly described Brexit as a mistake and expressed frustration that it complicated U.S. efforts to rebuild alliances against China and Russia. In March 2021, Biden's administration imposed tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from the UK as part of a broader review inherited from Trump, though some were later lifted after negotiations. The AUKUS Security Pact, announced in September 2021. Between Australia, the UK, and the US provided a positive counterpoint, deepening defense and technology ties in the Indo-Pacific, yet it also highlighted diverging priorities. America's intense focus on countering China contrasted with Britain's continued emphasis on European security, particularly after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Britain committed substantial military aid to Ukraine and pushed for stronger NATO responses, while the US led on sanctions and intelligence but faced domestic debates over sustained involvement. On climate policy, the UK positioned itself as a leader with its 2050 net zero target and hosting COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, yet US re-engagement under Biden through the Paris Agreement sometimes clashed with Britain's post-Brexit need for independent trade deals with high carbon economies. Economic disputes persisted into the mid-2000s, with periodic threats of US tariffs on British goods if the Northern Ireland Protocol issues remained unresolved, and no comprehensive bilateral trade agreement materialized despite repeated rounds of talks. Public rhetoric from Washington often framed Brexit as self-inflicted damage that reduced Britain's leverage, while British leaders insisted the move restored sovereignty and opened new global opportunities. Through it all, core elements of the special relationship remained intact. The Five Eyes intelligence alliance continued seamlessly, nuclear cooperation under the 1958 agreement endured, and joint military exercises and counterterrorism efforts persisted without interruption. The episode reinforced a pattern seen from Suez to Vietnam. The US and UK could disagree profoundly on major questions of the day, apply pressure through economics and diplomacy, and still preserve enough mutual reliance to weather the storm. As both nations navigated an increasingly multipolar world in the 2000s, with rising threats from authoritarian powers, the special relationship proved resilient but no longer unquestioned, a mature alliance capable of weathering disagreement without breaking. This final chapter in our exploration shows that while the bond remains special, it is now more pragmatic than sentimental, forged not just in shared history, but in the hard realities of diverging national interests and a changing global order.